welcome to the Intuitive Insights podcast series. I'm Nina Lockwood, founder and director of Intuitive Interim and Executive Search. Throughout this series, I will be sharing engaging conversations with talented leaders from across the UK transport sector. Today, I am delighted to welcome not just one guest, but two to the Intuitive Insights podcast, Fiona Taylor and Adrian Hanstock, who between them form the very first executive level job share at Network Rail as Route Director for Kent. I've very much enjoyed listening to both of their career stories, which are very different, and hearing the practicalities of a senior level job share as well as the benefits. I really do hope that you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Good morning and welcome to the Intuitive Insights podcast. Fiona Taylor, Route Director for Kent for Network Rail, and Adrian Hanstock, Route Director for Kent for Network Rail. So this is a first. So there's a couple of firsts here for the podcast. We've got two guests for the price of one, which we've never done before. So welcome to my first double act. It's an absolute joy to see you. And a first in respect to you are doing a job share, Network Rail's first executive level job share, and you've very kindly agreed, both of you, to come on the podcast to share your experience of that with the audience. So a very warm welcome, Fiona and Adrian.
Morning.
Thank you.
We're going to start in time-honoured Intuitive Insights fashion with your career stories, please, because this is something that we get lots of very, very positive feedback from our audience, that they love hearing people's career stories. Where have you come from? What have you done? And how have you got to the role that you're in today? And the feedback that we have had, which really warms my heart, is that hearing your story really helps people to see you as human beings, to see our guest as a human being who's got a story rather than just the job title that they currently hold. So Fiona, I'm going to start with you. Tell me, right from the beginning, go back to the beginning of the story. Tell me about your career, please.
Okay, well, I always summarise my career using the title, a version of the title of one of my favourite films, so a Steve Martin and John Candy film called Trains, Planes and Automobiles. And my career headline, if you like, is Trains, Planes and Buses.
Right.
So this is my 35th year now, scarily, in transport. So if I rewind to the beginning, I studied modern languages, and after I graduated, I worked abroad for a year. So I was already kind of in the transport environment by then because I was working as an overseas holiday rep. And I ran out of money, and I came back to the UK and found myself a temporary job at Heathrow Airport working on the information desk. So this is, for many people listening to this podcast, they won't even know what I'm talking about, because there was a time in airports where you went up to desks and spoke to people to get information, and also where we made all the flight announcements. And obviously that's all automated now and those things no longer exist. But to do that job, you had to speak two languages fluently, which is how my kind of education, if you like, and my career kind of came together. But it wasn't planned. It was purely to get some money. Yeah. And as I said, I went there on a part-time contract and ended up staying 17 years. So again, that wasn't quite what was planned, but I had 17 brilliant years in aviation, predominantly at Heathrow and a couple of years at Gatwick, and also worked overseas for a year. Overseas sounds very grand. I worked in Belgium with a consultant, helping them set up and run a new airport when they were building a new terminal there. And I guess the reason I stayed so long is because BAA, who was the company I worked for at the time, were incredibly forward thinking. They were very much into customer service as a priority, very much into development and career progression. So in 17 years, I had 15 different roles. So there was no need for me to leave because I was learning so much and doing so many different and interesting things, either moving laterally. And for me, that's always a really key thing, I think, to build skills and capability by looking at opportunities to go broader before you go higher. Yeah. So that was the first sort of 17 years. So almost half of my career basically in airports.
Yeah.
And then I left airports in, oh gosh, 2005. I came to Network Rail for the first time. So I was headhunted when Network Rail were going through reorganisation to come and join the rail industry. So I wasn't convinced at the beginning, if I'm perfectly honest, because I
Right.
was still loving aviation, but I kind of thought this is my one opportunity. If I don't change direction and change employer now, I may never do it. And I don't want to be a one company career person. Not
Yeah.
there's anything wrong in that, but I just felt at that stage that wasn't the right thing for me. So I then moved into my first time in Network Rail and spent 10 years in Network Rail, and again did a whole host of different jobs. So route director for several routes, including Sussex and what was Midland and Continental. I was then the route managing director for Stint, and I did a stint as transformation director, leading the first phase of devolution back in 2011. And then I had my final role up until 2015. I was the director of station strategy. So looking at what we can do with our stations in the future at an industry level.
Yeah.
And then I left. And then I became self-employed. So I did a whole host of different roles, predominantly in rail as a consultant. So some process improvements and change management, some restructuring. And also had a stint in the DFT as a project director and lead for one of the franchise competitions. And then I went into buses.
Yeah.
So I did a bit of stuff on my own, enjoyed it, but then got cold feet and decided that I needed to go back into, to being an employee, and was the managing director of one of the London bus companies for 2.5 years, obviously contracted by TfL. And then I came back to Network Rail. So I got enticed back to Network Rail again. And I've now been back as route director Kent for 3.5 years. So that's my potted career history.
That's brilliant. Thank you for that. And it's a wonderful kind of precise and concise trot through the different places you've been. Really curious to know about Network Rail then and Network Rail now, obviously working under different chief execs and working in very different times. Is there, I would imagine, a huge difference, but is it a huge difference, or is it still kind of the same place, but maybe a lick of paint? Or I'm trying not to be too political with this, but does it feel different than it did before?
It does feel different. I think the biggest difference that I could pinpoint, I mean, basically what we do is still the same. The nuts and bolts of what we do is what it was back when I joined. But I think the real big difference for me now is the real genuine deep emphasis on collaboration with operators and with other stakeholders, and with the focus on putting passengers and freight at the forefront of everything we do.
Yeah.
That feels much different to what it was like previously. We obviously worked with operators and talked about the service that we provide, but it now feels deeply ingrained and embedded in, if you like, the DNA of the industry, and certainly Network Rail. So I think that's the one area that I'd pick out as being fundamentally different.
Yeah, and that's really brilliant to hear, because the size of the organisation, it's like the proverbial turning a tank around, isn't it? When you need to effect any kind of cultural change in an organisation which is the size of Network Rail, then it is no small task to do that. So the fact that you're feeling it is a real positive, and makes me feel very optimistic and very hopeful for future change. Also really interested, Fiona, in the fact that that BAA way back in the day were already focused on customer service, because that is something which I think aviation has led the way in the transport industry in terms of service, absolutely. But the other thing which kind of resonates with I was on a webinar yesterday, hearing about recruitment, talent attraction and retention, and the fact that it's all around skills and upskilling people. So people not having to move out of the organisation to a different job in a different business, but doing those lateral moves that you mentioned and getting that really broad experience across the piece, which makes me think of the old management development programs back in the day, where you go and work in different functions over your first year, 2 years, 3 years, to get that kind of broad experience of how an organisation works and how it all fits together.
Yeah, and I think when I look back at my time in airport, it was hugely formative in terms of my own leadership development, partly because of the opportunity to kind of make many lateral moves and gain new skills and experience, plus a really strong focus on sort of professional development, so some great kind of training opportunities. But I think also what I would reflect on my time in airports was how forward thinking things were in respect of things like flexible working, particularly gender diversity. So I'm passionate about flexible working and job sharing, and I'm really proud of going back many years now to probably the early 90s, where I introduced the first job share in Heathrow that was between two security supervisors, because both colleagues had gone off on maternity leave, wanted to come back to their role and progress, but wanted to do it on a part-time basis. So there was quite a bit of pushback because it was really kind of breaking new ground, but we did it and it worked really well. And BAA had a number of senior colleagues that job shared.
Yeah.
And this is going back quite a long time. So although what Adrian and I are now doing is really kind of seen as groundbreaking, I come from a background where it was almost not the norm, but it happened at pretty senior levels. Time ago.
So
what I'm saying is there's more opportunity.
Absolutely, there is. I completely agree with you. And I think, going back into obviously it's been brought forward more in terms of that flexible working because of COVID and the fact that a lot of people were working from home. But we're kind of often met in this industry with but we can't all work at home. It doesn't work in this industry. But then I do remember listening to the person who is responsible for flexible working at the NHS. And I think, oh, right, if they can do it at the NHS, and if people are saving lives on a daily basis, or performing operations, surgery on a daily basis, and they can job share, surely there's a way that we can do it in the rail industry. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. But before we do that, let's bring Adrian in, and let's hear about a very different career story in terms of where you've come from, Adrian, and then bring us up to why the rail industry and why Network Rail in terms of your career.
Thank you. And it's always interesting listening to Fiona's background. And what strikes me from the outset is how similar we are in many ways, both in our career backgrounds and the opportunities, I guess, but also, and we'll perhaps come on to that when we talk about how the job share works, in our personal backgrounds. We've got a lot of similarity there. Fiona started with talking about the film that underwrites her career history, and I was thinking, well, what might mine be? And the one that sprung to mind immediately was Ask a Policeman, which is a 1933 Will Hay sort of farce, which is not a descriptor of my career background, I hope, but more probably a shine on my sense of humour. But like Fiona, I spent nearly 40 years as a police officer, and in that time was able to reinvent myself over and over again in the same business. So that included different specialisms, different roles, different ranks, different parts of the country, different police forces. And so, that ability to move around, develop the personal, professional, and leadership skills have, I think, brought me to the position I am now today, that allows me to bring, I guess, old eyes onto new problems. So big organisations, as we've just heard from Fiona's experience, they have very similar issues over time, and you know, that connection between public outcomes and public interest that the railway has today was exactly the same in policing, and so there is absolutely some crossover. But you know, I thought I'd take you through a little bit of my history. How did I get into that?
Yeah.
Again, huge similarity. I'd been dubbing around doing bits and pieces and thought, well, I probably, now I'm 19, ought to think about getting some money behind me. And I applied for a temporary role working at the police headquarters locally as a filing clerk. And that's what I did. And I worked in the criminal records office on a 24-hour shift basis. And in the wee hours and the rainy Sunday afternoons, I'd go into the archive and pull out a murder box and read all of the history of a particular case.
Oh my word, how interesting!
And I'd always been a sort of a Agatha Christie and crime fan as a kid, and so reading these real stories and looking at statements and crime scene photographs and the court transcripts, it really was fascinating. And I think from that, I just developed an enthusiasm for policing, and there were a couple of reasons why it probably wasn't right or proper that I would become a police officer. Fiona's mentioned about the challenges, I think, with diversity and equality going back in time, and equally joining the police in the mid-80s as a gay man was not a very straightforward thing to do. No. So you have to test yourself, and again, I suspect over time it's a part of your own personal resilience, as many people who experience those kind of challenges do. And it's good to then be able to influence as you become more senior. But that's I guess a separate topic.
And a really fascinating one, actually, Adrian. I'm really, really interested to hear more about that. But as you say, that a big topic in itself, probably.
Indeed. And now I look back, policing at the moment, it has a really unfortunate spotlight on it because of the horrific actions of a few individuals that are overshadowing what people do every day. And when I think back to what I found rewarding in that career, my ambition, having read all of those case histories, was to become a detective, which I did very, very quickly, and had a fascinating career, both from a personal interest point of view, as you try all of the tactics within the law to catch those who operate outside it. And I worked in undercover policing, I worked in gun crime, I was tackling sexual violence in London, I dealt with youth murders, some really complex things that you have to really trawl your creativity in a way that protects the public, and that's not straightforward. And I think a lot of that gets lost in the narrative of what policing is doing to protect public interests at the moment. And as my career developed, I moved. I started in the Midlands. I was born and raised in Nottingham. I moved to London in the sort of early 2000s, and that was interesting because I thought I would become a very small fish in a big pool, and so you just kind of just get on with what you have here, and that's probably it. But interestingly, and I think it's as was mentioned earlier, how do you bring a new approach to problems that you see differently if you've come from outside an organisation? Very quickly, a few people sort of took interest in how I approach things, what I was doing, my particular leadership style, and I got promoted quite rapidly. And eventually, a real highlight was to take over my own command, where you can then start setting the tone and the culture and the direction, things that we're doing even now in our joint role. So they come with you regardless of the organisation, I guess. And then after that, spent a fascinating time working on the Olympics, and I led all of the surface transport arrangements. So that you can start to see now a theme of me moving towards this role currently.
Yeah.
And that was just wonderful, working on such a major worldwide global event, and ensuring every day ran successfully, because you think the opening ceremony is it. Well, it's not. Every day afterwards is like the first day, because it has to equally run without problems. And again, I apply that parallel to what we do on the railway. Every morning startup has to be pretty good, otherwise there's millions of very disaffected people.
Absolutely.
And then just, I guess final stages, I then spent 11 years really in senior command roles, leading policing across, again, a number of disciplines, criminal justice and investment, transformation, eventually moving over to British Transport Police, which was quite an amazing change from working in geographical police forces, because of its national nature, working across 3 countries, 2 different legal systems, thousands of miles of track, and all of the partners that Fiona was describing, those stakeholders who want the railways to be safe, gave a very different combination of working in a commercial setting almost, but with a public service expectation. And I finished there last year, actually. So I spent sort of 7 years as the Deputy Chief Constable, and for a time as the Interim Chief Constable. And having retired, I thought, well, this is going to be good, isn't it? I'm going to fill all my days with all the things that I haven't done for many years, reading, listening to music, seeing the family. And that was good. It was great for a while, but actually my mind started getting bored. And so when this opportunity arose, it really sparked my interest, because we I hope come on to this, because what it does offer doing the job share arrangement is that strategic, that operational, that organisational challenge every day that really tests your resilience, your resolve, your experience. But it equally provides the balance to do those other things that I like to do, running charity work, spending time with, understandably, an ageing family, and other things that are really important. But I guess my last bit would be, so why the railway? Well, maybe it's somehow in the family DNA, because my father was a train driver.
Oh, right, okay.
And actually both my brothers work for Network Rail as signallers, and have done for decades. So it's an interesting conversation when all of us get together, with my dad's history of working on steam trains, my brothers working through what was rail track, Network Rail, and today, and then my background and 72 days experience of the railway, that I try and tell them what I think is right and not.
Brilliant. Adrian, thank you. There's so many things I want to ask you about here, in terms of that that experience of coming through. First of all, going into this temp role at police headquarters in the criminal records office, and I've kind of got this image in my head, of all these boxes and files and folders and stuff, and then realizing that actually you were really interested in this, want to be a detective. You've made it sound really easy, from you sitting there in what I've got. I've got this very much kind of image in my head. You sat at a table, there's a light shining above you, you've got these dusty files out. How do you go from that to then becoming a detective, in your own words, quite quickly? You made it sound really interesting to go from that temp job into solving crime.
Well, do you know what? And it plays into a lot of the things that we like to do now. It's being spotted by somebody as potentially having the talent to do it. And there was a fantastic inspector there. And I remember him approaching me one evening and saying, so, you're obviously learning a lot about the role in here, but how do you feel about, going out and sitting in the back of one of our patrol cars for a couple of hours one evening to sort of understand the area and get a sense of what police officers do, so that when you're talking to them on the phone, because I did move into answering 999 calls as well for a while.
Right.
So those, you'll get more of an appreciation of what they're doing when when they're asking for information. I thought, well, that is brilliant. It's like, having your very own fly on the wall series, sitting
Yeah,
to fly on the wall.
absolutely.
And so I did that, and for a whole week on nights, I went out with two brilliant police officers who I remember to this day, John Ockrodge and John Fowles, and they took me out, and they, of course, it was very different days then. The demand wasn't quite the same, and we got to see so many things. And at the end of the week, I went to see the inspector, who's my boss, and said, thanks very much. That has just been fascinating. And he opened his desk drawer and said, well, I thought you'd enjoy it. He said, why don't you think about filling in this application form and becoming a police officer? And I'd never thought about it. I said, how long does it take to get through it? And he said, well, about 9 months to go through the process. And I thought, well, that's brilliant. I can get a little bit fitter. I can talk to some of the probationers and find out what's involved and, get a bit of inside knowledge. I can save up and buy a new car. I said, I'll do it. And can you believe 3 weeks later, I was standing on a parade square in the cold morning air with a big hat and an equally oversized tunic on.
Yeah.
Being told to stick your chest out, lad. and
Brilliant.
And it went really quickly because, I was already working in the organisation. They kind of knew me. My vetting had already gone through.
Yeah.
And they fast-tracked it. So it just meant from there on, I could concentrate on, well, now I'm in an organisation that I really think I'll enjoy. So how do I get to do what I want to do? And I made a nuisance of myself with the CID, basically. I go and make tea, ask if I could go out with them on warrants. I'd sit in and do interviews with them and take statements. And so when a vacancy came up again, the DI said, well, you've shown an interest. Why don't you start on Monday as a temporary detective? And I never looked back, I don't think.
Brilliant. I love this. There's this kind of this really important bit around being talent spotted. So we can say you were in the right place at the right time, or we can actually acknowledge that something about you and the energy that you were bringing to a temp role in the Criminal Records Office, which I'm going to hazard a guess, Adrian, that wasn't the most exciting role. But something about you and the energy that you were bringing to it and the way that you were doing it, the way that you were kind of, even at that stage, making yourself visible to the people who were working around you was making a difference. So that person giving you that opportunity was a real turning point, wasn't it, in your career? And the phrase making a nuisance of yourself, then, we could also say, couldn't we, that you were using your initiative and you're putting yourself, again, being visible. These days, we talk about things like personal brand and kind of being out there and making yourself visible to the powers that be, if you like, within industry, within business. And what you've shared with us is really great examples of doing that early on in your career, which I'm sure then kind of filtered its way all the way through to what you're doing now.
I do hope so. And they're things that you probably know much later in your career once you've gone through some leadership development and you're sort of exposed to the thinking that I perhaps didn't appreciate then. Things like imposter syndrome, recognizing the need for great role models in an organization. Yeah. And importantly, for those leaders, them having the, I guess, humility to recognize actually it's better now to try and bring others through the organisation than concentrate on my own ambitions. Or, I've reached a level where my goal now is to future-proof the organisation with the people I think will run it well. And of course, you, as a beneficiary of all that, you don't necessarily see it at the time. 19, 20, 21. I wouldn't have been able to put those labels to those activities. But now, of course, we do recognise that and the importance of taking people sometimes out of their comfort zone, giving them the development, certainly giving them the support and championing them, things that we benefited from. And I think if you can see it through that lens, then hopefully it makes you a better leader.
Absolutely. I definitely think it does. I saw something earlier today around, so it was International Mentoring Day yesterday. And I saw a comment on LinkedIn earlier where the person was acknowledging the fact that when, as a mentor, your mentee, you hope, gets something out of that relationship, but actually you get so much out of it yourself. And certainly I do mentoring through the Women in Transport scheme, and I'm in my 4th year of doing this now. It is a highlight every single year to meet the new mentee and to have those conversations on a monthly basis, and see the light go on, see the penny drop, however we want to say it, but helping people to realize that they're actually pretty flipping marvelous already, and you're just kind of helping them to understand how they go on to the next thing. I think you reach a point in your career, you're absolutely right, Adrian, you're not necessarily that aware of it at the earlier stages. As we move on and we have that opportunity to pull other people up the ladder behind us, it makes you feel good, actually. It's a really positive thing to be involved with, from my experience.
I couldn't agree more. And I do that now with emerging police leaders. I still keep a hand in coaching and supporting and developing in a similar way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's that little bit of give back in the way I receive. So
Yeah.
It's been a charm, I have to say, despite the somewhat rather negative headlines that you sort of have to see for the importance of what they are and how they'll get,
of course,
resolved separately.
It's a relatively few people impacting on a huge organisation, the majority of which is doing an amazing job for the public. Let's move on to talk about the job share. I think I can really relate to your comment, Adrian, around retiring and then thinking, oh, right, hang on, not quite sure I can fill every day with reading and listening to music and seeing the family. I remember being in my very first job at 16, getting my first wage and working out how many more wage packets I would have until I retired. So I'm 16 years of age. I'm stood there at the information desk, actually, Fiona, at NatWest in Leyland, and working it out. How many paydays have I got left until I can retire? And now I find myself at kind of approaching retirement age. So I'm 54 this year, and I'm thinking, but actually, retirement age as it used to be. I mean, obviously it's changed recently anyway, but retirement age being 60 is only 6 years away, and it's like, well, I definitely won't have had enough by then. It's changed, hasn't it? The world has changed. We're all kind of enjoying our careers longer, but you make a really good point. There's more to life than work as well. So having that balance and being able to do other things, whether that's kind of charitable interests, families, personal interests, whatever it is just an amazing opportunity for individuals, but actually for organisations, for really forward-thinking organisations, to make best use of people, whatever stage of life they're at, because there's a lot of talent out there that we run the risk of ignoring or losing because we're not being flexible enough. So, Fiona, I'm going to come to you as a veteran of job share, because as you mentioned, you introduced it when you were at Heathrow. So tell us about the concept of job share. Why does it work?
I think you've touched on some of the points when you were kind of summing up there, Nina, a moment ago, but it works because you do really get two heads, if you like, for the price of one. So if you look at myself and Adrian, we bring, 75 odd years between us of experience, of leadership experience, managerial experience into the one role. Yeah. So there's real depth of knowledge that can be drawn on that you get through job sharing, and from an organisational point of view, that's really valuable because you're bringing in and retaining knowledge and experience that otherwise may have gone completely to do other things, but you are getting real value out of two people with complementary and different skill sets.
Yes. Yeah, and that's important, isn't it? That different, it's complementary, but it's different. Yeah. So in terms of diversity of thought, for example, you really are getting that two heads for the price of one, aren't you, in that different approach? Is that always straightforward? How does it work in practical terms? So just even logistically, are you both based in an office? Do you have a shared day when you're both at work, or how do the practicalities work?
Okay, it's really important you get the kind of practicalities and the logistics right from the outset. And of course, this is still in its infancy, really. We're what, 5-6 months in now, Adrian, something like that. We started September, wasn't it? We started actual job sharing, so
Yeah.
4 or 5 months. And it was there was a few bits that were a bit bumpy at the beginning, but the key thing is there's probably 3 things. One is around the relationship between the 2 people that make up the job share partnership, and that has to be based on really strong communication, finding a way of handing over to each other, particularly in our kind of role, because it's not, we don't work in discrete areas because it's the role it is. We need to hand over all the time to make sure that we're both up to speed with what's been happening. So it's communication, trust, and right from the outset having a conversation that says, a bit like being parents, if you and I have a difference of opinion about something, that's fine, because that's about diversity of thought. Let's work that out between us in the background, so that when we go back out into the work environment, we are seen as as one voice, and that you can't kind of pick us apart. So that's really important. On a more practical level, it's about the arrangements that you put in place. So we work 3 days a week. We have a day when we're both working, which is interestingly Wednesdays. So doesn't necessarily mean we're in the same place or in the same office, because obviously the nature of the role means that I'll be doing something and Adrian might be doing something different, or we might be together. Which is why the handover bit's so important, because we're not joined at the hip, and we do go and do things on behalf of our role. So having really strong PA support. So we're fortunate to have a brilliant PA who really manages the diary. So we have one diary, we have a shared inbox, so we don't have separate inboxes. We have one for us and a diary for us. Practical things like diverting our phones to the person that's working, so that the one who's not working doesn't get phone calls. So all those little bits and pieces that you need to get in place from the beginning, and then having a conversation with our direct reports and with other stakeholders about how we saw the arrangement working, and making sure that people knew that it was okay if things weren't working from their perspective. So whether that was our line manager or our team or our other wider colleagues, to be able to say, this bit's not working, can you sort it out? So that's kind of in a nutshell. I don't know whether I've missed anything, Adrian, that you would add to that.
No, I don't think so. I think the only other element that is probably more personal is recognising that it's not just a hard stop if you're already doing the role, or it's simply a 3-day 9-to-5 commitment in these kind of roles, because it is executive. We do speak on days that we're not necessarily working, or we do commit to a degree of flexibility to ensure continuity on things that we've been working on, which is it's like any big role. They're the sort of swings and roundabouts that come with taking that on. But I think the important thing, as Fiona mentioned, though, is that frank and very honest relationship we have to talk about what hasn't worked, what isn't going well, either in the business or in things that we've done. The feedback loop, and that we're just very practical in the way we do it. The other thing that I'm fairly confident in that short time that this is translating into the way we work with our teams. We're very consistent in the type of people we are. Trying not to get too hysterical, because things are always going wrong. So you need to bring that calmness. Regardless, in my case, of previous experience in this industry, it'd be terrible to start flapping around because there's something you don't know. You find out and then make your decisions on that basis. But equally, and I don't know whether I can speak for you on this, Fiona, but I think it's about not having an ego and a particular ambition to do anything more than this role brilliantly, but at the same time enjoy the time you get to do those other things you mentioned. That's the real prize, personally. And I think, as I said, that's on feedback that we've asked our teams for and that they have given us in leadership sessions. I don't think they're seeing a split, and it is consistent, and our availability and our decision making, it hasn't rocked the boat.
And that was really important, because certainly when we were setting this up, the team had some nervousness around, well, how is it really going to work? And, how are we going to have, two people doing one job, and how's that going to affect the relationship? So there was a degree of nervousness. So, when Adrian was appointed, it was really important that he and I worked out how we were going to work together so that the teams didn't see any kind of gaps or schisms. And generally the feedback so far is really positive, but it takes effort, and it takes, as I said, as well as the kind of relationship piece, the kind of logistics and machine that goes on in the background, driven by our brilliant PA to keep things on track.
Yeah. It's how did it come about in the first place?
Okay.
Where did the idea come from?
Okay, well, I'll have to answer that, because that was obviously before Adrian joined. It was just over a year ago, so it was December last year. I had a one-to-one coming up with my then line manager, John Housel, and I have just had a big milestone birthday. So last December, I knew that this big milestone birthday was coming, and I'd got to a point, a bit like Adrian's just said, where, I don't have an ego. I don't want to go any further in terms of hierarchy now. I've got to a stage where I want to do something that's interesting and challenging, that I enjoy, and that, I hope I'm still adding value and I'm good at. But I want to start making a transition, if you like, out of a full-on executive career, because I've been doing these kind of roles for years and years, into something that allows me to start doing other things outside of this part of my life. So, trustee, non-exec activities, and just to start to shift the balance to get me ready at some point to make the transition into whatever my retirement looks like. So I had that conversation with John, and I honestly wasn't sure how it was going to go. It could have gone a number of ways. It could have gone, well, that's great, you just need to decide when you're going to resign or retire then. Or it could have been, okay, well, we'll see what we can find you to do part-time. But it was John who actually said, well, why don't we look at job share in the route director role, Fiona? What do you think?
Right.
And I went, what a brilliant idea. And then kicked myself for not having thought about it. And that's how it started. And from that conversation in December, we went out to recruit in January, which was when Adrian saw the advert. And then we ran a very thorough sort of 4-stage recruitment process that involved peer conversations, interviews with a cross-section of our people across the business, and also involved our train operator, managing director, having a say in the final appointment as well. So really good response. We had, I think it was 49 applicants in total. And then through that process ended up being fortunate enough to find and appoint Adrian. So that's how it came about.
Brilliant. And top marks to John for being so forward thinking and coming up with that idea in the first place. Amazing. And I was actually going to ask you about the recruitment process, because I think from my experience, it would be so important that as many people, without wanting to kind of bring the world and his wife or the world and her husband into the mix, then you do have to take account of different people's views on this, your stakeholders, including your team, because it is new, and your success of your role, of this job share role, is dependent on those stakeholders supporting you to do that role in the way that you need to do it, isn't it? Have you had any feedback? I know you've encouraged that from your team to kind of let us know what's working, what's not working. Has that happened much?
Yeah, and it's a conversation that Adrian and I sort of have on an ongoing basis with particularly with our team. And so far, no one has said, "Oh, this really isn't working." There's been little tweaks around, certain ways of working, not about decisions so much, but about logistics sometimes. So what we've made a commitment as part of the way we work is to say, if you have a conversation with one of us or you talk to one of us about something, assume that you've spoken to both of us, so that in the beginning people kind of wanted to tell us both.
Yeah.
And we said, no, you don't need to do that. That's our responsibility. You don't worry about that. You've done your bit.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to add, Adrian.
I think that's absolutely right, and it is new and unusual, I guess, for some of our stakeholders. And I guess from my perspective, coming new into such a complex business, I thought policing was complex and had acronyms, but this is on another level. And there's a bit of personal development that I'm still going through. You can get immersed in the day to day, but equally there's more power and credibility once you know with some conviction what you're talking about, and that's only going to come with experience. And I have to still remind a few people that I'm not offering an excuse here, but I might need a little bit of time to go and find out what you're asking me.
Yeah.
And I think if there is that, that again, you have the strength, I think, in your own ability to show your flaws or your lack of knowledge when you've got a bit of time behind you. And it's interesting actually, because if you look at it through that lens, I think about what does that mean for some of our junior colleagues who are starting out new in either new roles or just been promoted, and we might be asking some very pointed questions. You have to take a pause and say, actually, I'm in the same position as them, so I need to give them a bit of a break.
Yeah.
But the great thing is, and I think this is where the job share. Of course, I was absolutely flattered and thrilled to be selected out of that great cohort of people who applied. For a part-time role, that is a phenomenal amount of interest in my experience, and so. I do think those complementing skills, and that was part of my pitch, I guess, that, of course it would be very comfortable to select an identical person with an identical background to Fiona. You'd get absolute continuity, I'm sure. But I hope that we bring together, bringing those complementary skills together, it allows us to look at things very, very differently. And I'm sure that's happening because that, it fuels the conversations we have. Well, what about this? And we're talking about this just this morning about some of the organisational changes that are needed. And of course, I can draw on my last 10 years of changes in policing. That,
of course,
challenging and difficult, but are familiar.
I think, I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation, finding it fascinating. I'm also need to be mindful of the time that I've got allocated in your diaries. So, if I can summarise in terms of advice that you would give to employers, but also people seeking a job share arrangement, then I think from what I'm hearing is there needs to be, just be aware that there needs to be a different type of recruitment process. You can't do your normal interview once or twice and just with the senior team or the hiring manager, etc. There needs to be much greater involvement of the stakeholders, of all of the stakeholders, in the most kind of productive and efficient way. Communication is absolutely key, isn't it? The communication between the two of you, whether that's kind of just generally, but also in terms of having that really effective handover to make sure that nothing important falls in the gap between one of you finishing and the other one starting your working week. So communication, I think trust and honesty are coming across loud and clear for me. It's kind of you need to know that the other person has got your back. And I guess that actually is kind of resonates with your police career as well, Adrian. It's kind of knowing that your partner in a kind of Cagney and Lacey style, then you need to know that the other, I'm really aging myself there, aren't I? The other person has got your back, and whatever you do, you are speaking with one voice, to use Fiona's phrase from earlier. and that kind of, that united front and speaking with one voice, but absolutely acknowledging that you're both bringing very different skills and experiences to the party, which must make for a very interesting offline, behind the scenes conversation as well. Anything else that would be your advice to an employer or to someone considering job share?
Yeah, I would summarise this, and I've had a couple of conversations with people that have been watching what's happened and have been in touch to say, I want to do this, but how do I make it happen? And my advice would be, whether it's an individual or an organisation, is make it happen. Don't look for reasons to make it not happen, or to look for all the reasons about why it's going to be difficult. Go into it with a view that says, we make this work.
Yeah.
So it needs to be true to make it work effectively. Yeah. And for me, it's as simple as that. It's about having that desire and willingness to make it happen.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Fiona.
Yeah, and I think from me, for those who lead the organisation above us, they equally need to think a little bit more flexibly. They haven't now got two new people doing the job full time. They've still only got one role, just happens to be filled by two. And so sometimes the expectations are fine. I think sometimes it's the delivery and timeliness of recognising actually who's there today, who's doing what, and and of course a lot of that is down to us to make sure that that's equally clear. But it's not just necessarily straight line reporting in the way that it would previously have been. But this is, these are the settling issues for this type of role, and
of course.
And I, like Fiona, I know others who've done job share roles, part-time roles, flexible working very, very successfully over time. So I don't know quite why we're so fearful of it in many functions.
Yeah, I think people resist change generally, and so I think that advice that Fiona's just shared is just make it happen. Let's think about, and this applies to absolutely everything in life, doesn't it? Let's think of all the reasons why it will work, and let's go with that, and be prepared to spot any bumps in the road, acknowledge the teething problems, keep communicating, keep talking, and do something differently, which will actually feel better for you as an individual, because you're getting a much better work-life balance, and it's better for the employer because they're getting the massive advantage of 75 years plus worth of experience between the two of you. So what's not to love about that? It's ace. So I'm going to bring our conversation to a close with a bit of a big question, but it's one which I am really interested to hear your answer to. We've had obviously massive change in the industry, in the world actually, but in the transport industry and the rail industry in particular over the last couple of years or so. What I'm really interested in hearing is what you think the opportunities for the future are. So as we move ahead, and we've talked about one of the opportunities, which is looking at the workforce in a different way, and how can we be more flexible. But if you ruled the world, if you were right at the top and you were making all the decisions irrespective of what other limitations people or government etc. were putting down, what would you do differently?
It is a big question, isn't it? And
it is a big question.
Maybe I can look at it a bit idealistically.
Please, yeah.
I'm sure Fiona will spot the flaws in my my ambition straight away. But I guess if you're starting this all over again, like many public organisations, it's very difficult to invest in the way that is probably needed to, really future-proof what the customer wants, and that's our focus. What do the public need? More and more people are travelling. More and more people want to get around. Patterns change. COVID, had that impact, and there's a lot of people now maximising their leisure time and working business hours very differently. But who say that won't change again in time? There is a call for people to be back in the office, and and on that, very interesting. We had a session earlier this week where having everybody round the table and that natural interjection and way that the business and discussion flowed is much stronger than on an online session. So you can see where that might change in future. But so what would that be in a utopia position? Well, if we were building our railways from scratch today, they'd probably look very differently. And we learned lots of lessons that the Victorians perhaps didn't know. And so for me, it would be, having that real sleek, flexible fleet that just speeds along. It's seamless. And importantly, and this is where actually we're making some benefits, harnessing technology so that it might not be easy for some people to embrace now, but as the new generation come through that are all technologically savvy, I think how do we make that seamless movement of people and understand how they're affecting the ability of the railways to operate so we can respond quickly and effectively. And we're not really, dare I say, patching up a difficult network that we have currently. That brings its own challenges, it brings its own interests. But if we were doing it again today, we might take a very different look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Fiona, how about you?
I think I'd probably summarise, and no, I agree with what Adrian said there. I think if I look at it through a slightly different lens, so as a business within Southern Region, we've spent a lot of time looking at our culture and how we want to work and how we want things to feel. And we've got 3 culture principles that we've developed that are all about how we make decisions, how we guide and lead the business, and how it feels to work here. And for me, those 3 principles, I think, are a real opportunity for us to fundamentally change the culture and the way we work. So they are: keep it simple, and I think we have massive opportunity to simplify in what is a very complex and often overcomplicated industry. So that's principle number 1. The second one is show you care, and that's about showing care for our people and for each other, but equally showing that we care for our business and the sort of future health and longevity of our business. And then our third principle, which again I think gives us loads of opportunity to do things differently and better, is listen, learn and improve.
Right.
We've got so much that we can learn from things, both the things that go really well and equally the things that don't go so well. So for me, I'd really like a world where those principles, certainly within Southern Region, have truly come to life and create a working environment where people feel really valued and we're really kind of pushing things forward in a way that brings sustainable and positive change.
Do you will not hear any argument from me on any of those. I think those three principles sum it up beautifully. And you've and in devising those 3 principles, the team have really followed number 1 by keeping it simple. And that whole, building a culture that's based on those 3, then we can't go far wrong. So on that very optimistic note, I'm going to say a huge thank you to Fiona Taylor and Adrian Hanstock. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. There's so much more that I want to ask you both, but we are up against the clock. So I do need to say thank you to both of you and thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for sharing your experiences around the job share. And I'm sure I can speak for both of you. If anyone wants to pick the phone up or drop you an email to ask a specific question in terms of making it happen in their own area of the rail industry, then I'm sure you'd be open to a conversation.
Absolutely.
A pleasure.
Thank you so much, both of you. I really appreciate you joining me this morning.
Thank you, Nina.
Bye, Nina.
Thank you. My huge thanks to Fiona Taylor and Adrian Hanstock, both Route Director for the Kent region for Network Rail. I hope you enjoyed hearing their career stories and also picked up some practical tips in terms of the art of the possible of a senior level job share. Thanks so much for joining me. Please do come back again soon. Bye-bye.